Yeah, thank you, Melanie, for the kind introduction, and to Fabian and Klaas for the invitation, which is, of course, really wonderful because this is the area in Germany that I come from, so it's really coming home. What I want to do is to talk about the concept of the machine as a way to think about the relation between subjectivity and technology. I think that the term machine, is a marker for a particular modernist and now historical type of subjectivity. I want to historicize this notion of the machine, and in a certain way I also want to disperse it. You will see that in the talk. The main gesture, I think, of the talk is putting machine in inverted commas. On the German title, on the poster, they speak about the time after the human, art and technology after the human, nach dem Menschen. And I think if we say after the human, then we also have to say after the machine. I want to explain this, and thus also suggest why the notion of the machine may not at all be useful if we want to explore new forms of subjectivity, ones that we may call posthuman and that are in tune with the technological transformations that over the past 70 years have brought forth the posthuman subjects of today. The challenge, I think, is to address technology today, but not in the figure of something that is the other of the human, but a technology that we are of and that brings forth what we are. The notion of the machine has many interpretations and is applied in many different contexts. A complicated tension exists between the word's use and its meaning. When the term machine is used, it most often appears to designate a particular thing, an object, a mechanism, or a process, and yet in many of these cases the concept actually designates not a particular class of objects, but a relationship that human subjects have to technology. In this talk, I will try to explain this relationship by reviewing different types of machines and by showing how the concept of the machine is connected to the constitution of the modern subject. A word about the terminology that I employ. The semantic field of machine, technology, apparatus, device, medium, and so on is complex, inconsistent, and often contradictory. It would not make sense to try to correct this because the murkiness of the field merely emphasizes the multi-layered and contradictory ways in which people speak about and make sense of the technical agents of the world. There is a constant blending of technical, social, psychological, or biological registers in our language, and the notion of the machine is itself indicative of the translation of concepts between these areas. Towards the end of this talk, I will discuss my own suggestion for how the concept of the machine can be understood in a more or less precise or consistent way. Suffice it to say now that I myself try to use the term restrictively and present it primarily in context where it is used by others. The same applies for apparatus, which is an ambivalent term used either for concrete, circumscribed mechanisms or devices, or for complex assemblages of such mechanisms, what others have referred to as machinery or a mega machine. I will revisit some of these usages in a moment. The term technical and techniques, in the way I use it, refers to the concrete structures, material or conceptual, of making things work. Mechanics and mechanical indicate that force is conveyed in these structures by physical elements, a concept that is sometimes also used metaphorically to describe a simple, transparent effect. Perhaps somewhat unusually, I reserve the term technology for the theoretical reflection on techniques and for its ideological preparation. Put simply, technology is the abstract form in which people think about techniques, and it is the ideological form that makes people think about their world in technical terms. And finally, about the medium, while the machine works and conveys force, the medium enables communication and conveys meaning. A useful point of entry into a discussion of different machine types is the philosopher and logician Gotthard Günther and his essay Die zweite Maschine, the second machine. Günther employs a machine concept that is derived anthropologically and with reference to the German philosopher Arnold Gehlen, who, for instance, in his book Der Mensch of 1950, had dealt with the relation of humans to their environment, the Außenwelt, and with the transformation of this environment by means of tools. Animals also use certain parts of their environment to improve the functions of their own body, but only humans produce a tool for a specific future purpose. While the animal at best uses its environment in a tool-like manner, Günther explains, the human develops an autonomous tool as an independent form of existence between himself and the environment, Umwelt. An autonomous tool as an independent form of existence between himself and the environment. Such a creation requires that the creator relinquishes something and fixes it in an objective medium. The refinement of the techniques of tool making and the increasing use of synthetic materials led, this is quoting Günther, led to an obvious detachment of the tool from the natural context of the world. The machine is a technical appliance that assumes a form of autonomy from its human creator. Günther continues, our language is very precisely expresses this process of autonomization which takes place in this development. A tool is handled, a machine is tended, eine Maschine wird bedient. Ein Werkzeug wird gehandhabt, eine Maschine wird bedient. At least this is true of the older types of machines. A new type of machine, like the servo mechanism, does not even require tending anymore, but only occasional maintenance. A thermostat, which controls the temperature in a modern apartment, does not have to be tended in order to function properly. This mechanism directs its working mechanism itself. It possesses a spontaneity that is independent of the human. End of quote. Günther distinguishes between what he calls the first or Archimedean classical machine, which can be traced back to the lever, der Hebel, and which works with mechanical and moving parts, and the second transclassical machine, which has no moving parts and which, like the thermometer or an electrical transformer, works through the exchange of atoms, electrons, or electromagnetic fields. This non-Archimedean machine, Günther also calls a cybernetic machine, which no longer generates physical work procedures. This is left to the classical mechanism, but conducts and critically steers such working procedures. Günther emphasizes that at the time he was writing his text in the early 1950s, such cybernetic machines did not yet exist. Thus, he writes, the idea of the cybernetic machine aims at the realization of a mechanism which can record data from the external world, process them as information, and then pass them on as control impulses to the classical machine. Besides, the latter is not absolutely necessary. A calculating machine, for instance, provides arithmetic information directly. As analogies for the first or classical Archimedean machine and the second or transclassical machine, Günther proposes the human arm for the first and the brain for the second, respectively. An important aspect of the second machine is that it not only processes but also produces information. In addition to these two machine types, the isolated technical object with a limited functional autonomy and the cybernetic controlling and self-controlled device or system, we can easily identify at least three other conceptions of machine that are used in the course of the 20th century. The mega machine, alternatively referred to as machinery, apparatus, or state machine, is associated with authors like Louis Mumford, Karl Marx, and Louis Althusser. The machine of mathematical calculations and algorithms was described by Alan Turing, and the abstract and autopoetic machines of desire and heterogenesis were conceptualized by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, following Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. And this, of course, connects to what Erich Hörl was talking about last night. The US historian and critic Louis Mumford spoke about machines extensively in his books Technics and Civilization of 1934 and The Myth of the Machine in the 1960s, both of which express his skeptical attitude towards the influence of technology on human life. Mumford distinguishes between specific machines, like the printing press or the power loom, and the machine in general. This quote I don't have. He says, this is Louis Mumford, "When I use the term machine, I shall employ it as shorthand reference to the entire technological complex. This will embrace the knowledge and skills and arts derived from industry or implicated in the new techniques, and will include various forms of tools, instrument, apparatus, and utility, as well as machines proper." So the machine, or the mega machine, is all of these things. Based on such a generalized understanding of the machine complex, Mumford develops the concept of the mega machine, which encompasses political, economic, military, and bureaucratic techniques. For Mumford, the mega machine is a regime that subordinates humans through a multiplicity of individual procedures, yet remains invisible as a total structure. It is a machine conception which echoes Karl Marx's industrial machinery, animated by capital, and Louis Althusser's ideological state apparatuses, which interpolate humans as their subjects. While Mumford thus applies the concept of the machine to the workings of large socio-technical infrastructures, mathematician Alan Turing, also working in the 1930s, proposed the concept of a machine which would solve all calculable problems by a limited number of programmed steps of calculation. From this conception emerged the idea of a universal machine that would be able to simulate all other machines. Turing understood the mathematical relation of numbers as an abstract form of mechanics and thought of the algorithm that determines the operational steps as a computational machine in the sense of a single-purpose apparatus. In his 1950 text describing what has become known as the Turing test, which asks whether a distinction can be made between humans and machines, Turing made an important qualification. All machines except digital computers were excluded from this test. The machines that the universal machine could simulate were supposedly only the mathematical machines of the Turing type. In the 1960s, Chilean biologist and cybernetician Umberto Maturana introduced another application of the notion of the machine, which was later developed as a philosophical concept by the French philosophers Félix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze in the 1970s. Maturana and his colleague Francisco Varela described living systems as autopoietic machines. These machines form systems of elements that are always already connected in comprehensive and multiple codings and couplings. Guattari and Deleuze took this understanding of the autopoietic self-production and reproduction of machinic systems, which Maturana and Varela had chiefly applied to living systems, and Deleuze and Guattari applied it first to psychological contexts, especially through the concept of the desiring machines, Wunschmaschinen, and later to a broad range of social, natural, technical, and psychic phenomena. Rather than the noun machine and its connotations of a given structure or assemblage of parts, Guattari and Deleuze's understanding is best represented by the adjective machinic, which they employ to describe the heterogenic, open, and dynamic processes of coupling and decoupling that can occur in such diverse environments. In the micromechanisms of these machinic processes, there is, as historian of science Henning Schmidtgen outlines, I quote, always one machine which brings forth an energy flow and another machine which is coupled with it and which makes a cut tapping into the energy flow. This cut, coupure, of one machine into another takes the form of an event or incident, and it happens immediately. It is significant, and I think that's where the question of the a-signifying semiotics comes back in, that Erich talked about yesterday. It is the cut, the machine, it is significant insofar as it transposes expressive material from one machine to another and ruptures the semiosis of the second. The machinic cut is the interface, it is the field of potential agency and a field of potential subjectivation. Gotthard Günther's conception of the machine is one of an autonomous mechanism, whereas Mumford views the machine as a totalizing structure. Turing, in contrast, focuses on the rational functionality of arithmetics. And Guattari and Deleuze adapt the machine metaphor in order to find a description for processes of subjectivation and desire that would rest, and this is why they use the machine metaphor originally, I think. They use this to rest the processes of subjectivation and desire free from Freudian and other fixations and connect them to social and ecological strata. The Austrian theorist Gerald Raunig concludes, from this perspective, Guattari's extensive concept of the machine is a strategy to pitch the machine both against the danger of structuralization and state apparatization and against the effects of identitarian closure of concepts of community. Instead, the machine is taken as a non-identitarian conceptual container for everything that escapes stratification and identification, and that at the same time invents new forms of the concatenations of singularities, Verkettung von Singularitäten. This conception of the machine is a deliberate attempt at unhinging the dichotomous understanding of human and machine, or organism and mechanism. Raunig explains, the issue is no longer the confrontation of human and machine, or their possible and impossible correspondences, extensions and replacements of one by the other, or ever new relations of similarity or metaphorics between humans and machines, but the concatenations and the question of how humans can constitute a machine together with other things. These other things may be animals, tools, bodies, utterances, signs, or desires, but they become machine only in a process of exchange. End of quote. And I think this is what I'm going to kind of say again in a moment, but I want to kind of emphasize that I think that this usage of the term machine makes it so flaky that it doesn't help for understanding, because it cuts itself off so directly from all the other understandings of what machines might be, that it can only lead to continuous misunderstandings about what somebody means when he says machine. And unless people start saying, I mean the machinic in the Guattarian sense, then it begins to make sense.
This is true, what Raunig says.
Sorry?
Taken that this is true, what Raunig says.
Of course. Yeah, but I'm looking at the discourse and it's not so, and I think that, but you get the same misunderstandings in Guattari. That's what I said yesterday. I think that Guattari is also not entirely strict about the usage of the term. While the motivation of such an appropriation is understandable, I would question how successful this bending of the machine concept and the reversal of its connotation have been, just in practical terms. After a flurry of adaptations of the term in the 1990s, especially in the immediate wake of Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus, the machine's technical and mechanical connotations have persisted. In their respective contexts and discourses, the 5 machine concepts summarized here, the mechanical, the cybernetic, the totalitarian infrastructure, the mathematical, and the heterogenetic, exist side by side, and people deploy them for their respective conceptual and ideological impact. There have been other analytical attempts at reaching a conclusive understanding of what a machine really is. In his comprehensive study of the cultural history of the spirit of the machine, vom Geist der Maschine, German cultural historian Martin Burkhardt describes the machine's relation to the human unconscious and thus elucidates its phantasmatic significance in an extensive sweep from the prehistoric time of the Mesopotamian civilization to Charles Babbage, Ada Lovelace, and Alan Turing. Burkhardt points out the tendency to conceive of machines as things, even though they are always preceded by a blueprint, a construction plan. Accordingly, Burkhardt writes, one could understand the machine as a constraint of thought, ein Denkzwang, which has only taken the form of a thing. This objectification has turned the constraint of thought into a practical constraint, and thus into what we call a machine, in the more narrow sense of the word. Such a constraint of thought does not necessarily have to get articulated in the form of a material automaton. It can just as well be realized in a social organization, or it can take the form of a sign system, for instance, of a merely symbolical machine. If we look for a point of intersection of all of these phenomena, it would probably be the aspect of intrinsic necessity, Zwangsläufigkeit, which provides the impression that we are confronted with a machine. There is a clue at the end of this passage which I want to highlight here. I think I did that for the... The machine always seems to be something that we are confronted with. It is not only a metaphorical concept that can relate to many different constellations of intrinsic necessity, as a description of something external, but the machine always has the human subject as a companion and highlights the relation that human subjects have towards technology. I cannot go into the long history of the machine metaphor here, which, for instance, has been sketched by the German philosopher Hans Blumenberg. Importantly, the modern understanding, and this is what I'm talking about here, the modern understanding of the machine emerges around 1600 at a time when it is transformed from a theological into an anthropological category. This anthropological aspect of the machine is associated with 17th century French philosopher René Descartes, who not only formulated the dictum of the cogito ergo sum as the core of a modern and self-reflexive subjectivity, but also likened nature to a clockwork and described the human as well as the animal body as machines made by God in a manner more complex and more miraculous than all the machines and automata that humans could build. The beginning of the modern machine discourse is thus marked by the theoretical constructibility of humans and their similarity to machines. Mal eben gucken, wie ich hier. Genau. The Cartesian assumption that the function of an organism can be explained mechanistically is, as the historian of... Haben wir hier so ein ganz böses Feedback gerade? Muss ich näher ran oder alles gut? Okay. The Cartesian assumption that the function of an organism can be explained mechanistically is, as the historian of science Georges Canguilhem has argued, historically based on the construction of automata. The comparison of the body with a machine presupposes human-made apparatuses and the physical detachment of these apparatuses, which are no longer held and handled as tools and extensions of the body. And it's probably no accident that Canguilhem was writing this around 1950, at the same time when Gotthard Günther was writing about the first and second machine. From this early moment onwards, humans associated with machines the danger, so this is from the 17th century onwards, associated with machines the danger of being submitted to an alien, non-human entity, or the danger of becoming a machine, or like a machine, and losing one's humanity. Inversely, the machine is the manifestation in which technology can become like humans. The troubling thought of such a confusion or fusion of human and technology generated disgust and resistance. In all treatments of the modern machine, whether we look at Marx or Canguilhem or at the father of cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, the direct and necessary coupling and companionship of human and machine are undisputed. Similarly, the research of experimental psychologists like Hugo Münsterberg, Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, or Alexei Gastiev into the scientific management of labor and psychotechnics at the beginning of the 20th century explored the movements and behavior of humans with the aim of optimizing work processes in industrial production. Gastiev's Institute for the Scientific Organization of Work and the Mechanization of Man, as it was called, founded in Moscow soon after the Russian Revolution, conducted physiological experiments towards the ergonomic improvement of the human body, putting the needs of the machine and the needs of the human body on a par. And I quote Gastiev, "We have to put the living work machine, the worker, we have to put the living work machine under equally favorable conditions as the automatic machine." Media historian Klaus Pias reminds us that in cybernetic theory, I quote, "both simply coincide, the human as a special case of the information machine and the information machine as a special case of the human. Thus, both of these categories collapse." End of quote. The meaning of the term machine in examples like these slides between the technical concrete and the metaphorical. Yet while other terms are regularly brought into play when specific technical details have to be described, the concept of the machine is always deployed in contrast to the human. Whereas the technical, in its different guises, exists independent of the human, the machine is invariably coupled to man. Two aspects are therefore constitutive for the notion of the machine: its coupling with the figure of the human and its conception of a condition of human self-definition. Historians of science Erich Hörl and Michael Hagner make this point in relation to Canguilhem's considerations on machine and organism. They write, "As early as 1953, Georges Canguilhem expressed the assumption that all machines might possibly have been designed after the prototype of organs and organisms. This assumption would not only imply that in human history the biological is characterized by the prosthetic, but it also shows that there is nothing beyond the inextricable relationship of human and machine, irrespective of the question, which of the two is the prototype for the other." This tight linkage has a technological dimension in terms of the interdependency of machine and organism, and it has at the same time a psychological condition, or anthropological if you like. Like Canguilhem, Gotthard Günther identifies the moment of detachment between human and tool as constitutive of modern subjectivity. a moment which, in Günther's account, engenders the possibility of the modern machine. And I quote Gotthard Günther, "The same process of detachment takes place on the subjective side." So this is the detachment of the human operator and the tool. The same process of detachment takes place on the subjective side. And it's my highlighting of this passage because he didn't italicize that. The tool makes itself independent from its creator. The lever, also der Hebel, that primitive man pushed under a rock, still needed the arm that pushed it down. The mill wheel that is driven by the water in the village stream is already independent of the human source of power. While the detachment of the tool from nature resulted in the creation of synthetic materials, that is, in a wholly new type of physical existence, on the subjective side, this detachment of the tool leads to the machine. A wind or water mill is not a tool anymore, but a machine. A machine is nothing other than a tool that has become autonomous within certain limits. Günther thus describes the modern subject and the machine as originating from the same moment of detachment, and the machine as a result of this process of subjectivation. It is an open question whether this formation of subject and machine is supplanted by the technological paradigm introduced by cybernetics and the computer. The historian of science Andrew Pickering has claimed that cybernetics has been a watershed that has drawn up a separation from modernity and the unquestioned validity of its distinctions between spirit and matter, soul and body, nature and culture, human and machine. My own preliminary answer would be that there is indeed such a rupture in the conception of technology, even though it did not happen all at once, but has been taking place over a period of decades. But part of this rupture is also the gradual devaluation of the concept of the machine, so that, unlike Pickering, I would argue that there has been a demise of the modern distinction between human and technics, and that human and machine have been jointly transformed into new post-human forms of subjectivation. And that's why at a conference like this, I think we have to think about techniques and technology and not speak so much about machines, which are historical as a phenomenon. But it's the latency of this concept that we still want to talk about technology as machine, kind of shows the insistence that we want to hold on to a modernist understanding of human subjectivity. The mechanical conception of the machine persists in many areas of technology, including cybernetics and computing. When referring to Turing's and Norbert Wiener's notions of the machine, they inherit the mechanical conception of its workings. In that sense, even the cybernetic notion of the machine remains symbolic of a mechanical machine. There is a surprising contradiction between the passionate determination with which the notion of the machine has been used through the last century and the striking diversity of its meanings. Each instance of its use seems to have the potential of generating a new facet of not only what a machine can be, but what it actually is. An important conclusion that can be drawn from the polyvalent and metaphorical use of the machine term is that the machine can never be taken for granted. When you say machine, don't expect that other people will understand it in the same way. The machine is not given but it has to be constructed, made, built. My suggestion is, as I said earlier, to generally put the machine between quotation marks and to see how it is being constructed and as what in different instances. I know I'm running over time, but I need this. A more general conception of the machine that I want to propose here attempts a formal description of the relationship between humans and technology and of the role that the machine plays in that relationship. For a long time, I had thought that a machine is not just a particular type of technical device or conceptual mechanism, one that must have specific features in order to qualify as a machine proper. If this were the case, the use of the term would be so chaotic and unreliable that it would be a more or less redundant term, its meaning swamped in noise. However, people speak of machines with so much insistence and passion. The title starts with this warm machines, and it's so affected. People speak of machines with so much insistence and passion that there seems to be something particular that they want to express. My first interpretation, therefore, was that the machine is the word that we use in the face of technical systems that are too complex to grasp and too all-encompassing to address, threatening humans to subside in an uneven, overwhelming encounter. Thus, when confronted with a technical system whose automatism is by its very nature beyond intuitive human understanding, we would say, a machine, making it appear as if there were one thing that we had in front of us, something that can be used and switched off, something that is domesticated, like this computer, for instance. We look at it and say, a machine can be switched off, something that is domesticated, at least through this act of naming, machine, you machine, even if its functions are beyond comprehension and direct control. This interpretation would work for classical mechanical machines like steam engines, power looms, or airplanes, and it would also explain why people sometimes speak of post-mechanical electronic and digital systems like this laptop as machines, trying to get a symbolic handle on something that is on a physical level unfathomable, unbegreiflich. There is a similar terminological difficulty with the concept of the apparatus. Like the machine, the term apparatus is used in a variety of ways, not least in various European languages, but two different interpretations stand out. The first is that of a relatively simple technical device, which does not have the complexity and autonomy of a machine. Think of a toaster or a shaver, ein Rasierapparat, while in the second interpretation, apparatus is used for the complex assemblage of multiple machines and systems, technical or social. As I said earlier, this second conception was worked out by Louis Althusser when he spoke about the ideological state apparatuses, appareils idéologiques d'État, which interpolate human individuals as subjects. Michel Foucault discussed the same conception as the dispositif, more or less, translated as apparatus in English, that is composed of technical, social, and institutional infrastructures and practices. In an essay on the question, what is an apparatus, from 2006, Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben analyzes and extends Foucault's conception of the dispositif. In his explanation, Agamben suggests a diagrammatic relation between apparatuses, living beings, and subjects, which, as I want to suggest, can also serve as a way to pinpoint the appearance of the machine. Agamben writes, I shall call an apparatus literally anything that has in some way the capacity to capture, orient, determine, intercept, model, control, or secure the gestures, behaviors, opinions, or discourses of living beings. I read that again because it's so long list. I shall call an apparatus literally anything that has in some way the capacity to capture, orient, determine, the gestures, behaviors, of living beings. The effect of this working of apparatuses on living beings are, again quote Agamben, between these two, as a third class, so the effect of this working of apparatuses on living beings are, between these two, as a third class, subjects. I call a subject, Agamben says, that which results from the relation and, so to speak, from the relentless fight between living beings and apparatuses. Similar to Althusser's conception of interpellation, subjectivation here emerges as a product of the dispositifs at work. In Agamben's interpretation, technology is one of the ways in which this production of subjectivity takes place. I quote again, at the root of each apparatus lies an all too human desire for happiness. The capture and subjectivation of this desire in a separate sphere constitutes the specific power of the apparatus. And I think that's the figure of detachment that Gotthard Günther speaks about. The capture and subjectivation of this desire in a separate sphere constitutes the specific power of the apparatus. I would like to adopt the diagram proposed by Agamben and propose adding the concept of the machine to it. If the subject wants to address the apparatus, if it wants to say something about the apparatus and its workings, it will, in all likelihood, choose the concept of the machine. And I think these subjects include people like Norbert Wiener and Gotthard Günther, or Martin Burkhardt, and maybe myself. The machine does not occupy the position of a technological other, but it is, like the subject, a product of the apparatus, named and constructed by the subject. The subject, which usually identifies itself as a living being, speaks of the machine as though it were on the outside, an other. Yet it is the subject's technological doppelgänger, an apparative sibling, ein apparatives Geschwister, or a complementary product of the workings of the apparatus. This diagram is useful for explaining the awkward relationship that people, as human subjects, maintain with machines. It makes it clear that machine is not a technical category, but a social one, and that it is a symbolic concept rather than a descriptive term for a concrete class of technical items. Another aspect of this diagram is that it shows clearly that it is always a subject that speaks of a machine. What it designates as the machine is a projection in the direction of the very apparatus that brings forth the subject. With this notion of the machine in mind, we can think of machine art as those artistic works and practices that, especially in the 20th century, articulated the relation between subject and the machines. And that's the topic of the book that I've just finished. A machine can never be taken for granted, but needs to be constructed, and it is actualized in the very instance when it is addressed. Machine art does just that. It constructs machines, these screens that human subjects set up in front of the apparatuses that construct them, and makes them explicit. This may by now be a historical experience that has been supplanted by a new eco-technological paradigm which constructs subjects as integral parts to the apparatuses. The biopolitical integration of living beings into the apparatus eliminates the antagonism between life and apparatus. And I think we're going to speak about that in the optimization panel tomorrow, not least in reference to the work by sociologist Nicholas Rose. So I repeat that because I think it's interesting and it connects to what Erich was talking about yesterday. So the biopolitical integration of living beings into the apparatus eliminates the antagonism between life and apparatus. And this posthuman turn might make the human obsolete, and with man's disappearance, it also affords the obsolescence of the machine. Thank you.
Maybe you can sit here, and this is your microphone. So, if I understood you correctly, you see machines as kind of like the mediator or the helpers we employ if we think about technology. And I was wondering, like, first of all, you refer to machines as something that comes from a machinic vision of technology. But then you said that machines are still employed as kind of like these thinking devices to comprehend of technology when technology becomes too overwhelming. So I was wondering, in between this kind of like this static definition of a machine that is still stuck in the mechanical age, and this thinking device, like the machine as a thinking device, the machine as a thinking device then in that sense includes that it changes over time, right? As technology changes over time. So I was wondering, where do you see the machine? Does it ever get, like, do we comprehend of machines as something different as technology evolves, or are we stuck in this machinic vision of the machine? Maybe if you could clarify that.
Yeah, if you have to ask that question, then I was very unclear.
Maybe I was just very not paying attention to my...
I have to explain myself. So, I can understand that it's confusing that I refer to many examples where the term machine is used to speak about technical devices.
Yep.
What I try to speak about only is the word machine that is being used and how it is being used. That's the only thing that I speak about. And yes, the term machine is used quite differently in different historical contexts, in different ideological contexts. And I think that it's interesting how diverse those applications are, so that it looks as though it's almost totally inconsistent. And in what I'm proposing at the end, I'm making a suggestion for finding a sort of consistency in the understanding of what the term machine does in our discourses on a kind of a meta level, if you like. And what I'm saying is that the term machine is used to describe a particular type of relationship that we have with technology. And the discussion begins, and I think that much of the talks on in the rest of the conference will in a way be about the new paradigm of technology that we have moved into. And the question that I wanted to place on the table for our discussions over the next 2 days is, do you really need the word machine in order to describe your understanding of current technologies? And is not the fact that you use the term machine, if you really have to, if you feel obliged, is that not a reference to an understanding of technology that we may really have overcome and that may really be of the past of the 20th century?
So your book on machine art then really is a historical book. And it only did, like, could you maybe allude to a couple of examples that you allude to in the book, that we get an understanding of that machine art?
The classic artists, maybe the kind of where it's most clear, is Jean Tinguely, who quite explicitly in the 1960s says the technical environment that we live in is changing. Technology is being hidden behind smooth surfaces, and that we don't understand the computers anymore. And in order to make images, sculptures, images, in relation to which we can still refer to technology, I make these sculptures from the debris of an industrial culture that is really of the past. So he was quite conscious that the conception of a machine that he produced in his sculptures was already historical in the 1960s. And it has a development that comes from at least the 1910s and 1920s, from Dada and Surrealism and so on. And then the book also deals with artists like Stellag or Herwig Weiser or David Rokeby, trying to explain how this understanding of the machine, a mechanical or machinic understanding of technology, persists until the end of the 20th century. And the last chapter of the book deals with what I call the ecology machine, which is a paradox. But in the last chapter, I try to explain how since the 1960s, this understanding really fades out. And what is faded in is a different understanding, and maybe environmental understanding of technology that also makes the term machine less usable, which is why then machine art is maybe really a historical phenomenon that belongs to a specific period. And we see some endings of this, but just like the organizers of the conference felt compelled to use the word machine in order to speak to the people who they want to come and listen to the conference or participate. In the same way, of course, that desire to understand technology in this old way persists, but I think that in order to understand our current technological condition, if I can use Erich's term there, in order to understand our current technological condition, I think the term machine is totally useless.
Okay. Yes, I see questions emerging. Shall I just...
I shouldn't say totally useless. It's not very helpful.
It's
Thank you.
anachronistic, probably. Yes, please.
Thank you, Andreas, for the talk. Let me just quickly react, as you can imagine. I mean, I completely agree what you said about the historicity of the term of the machine, but I would put it as in a slightly different way, because when you say that, I mean, there is a real inconsistency in the use of the concept in 20th century, I would agree, but I would say this is a symptom, and as such only, as a symptom, it is interesting. It expresses diverse conceptual strategies to deal with an ongoing shift in the historicity of technicity. And all these people you mentioned, they have exactly, in a way, the same problem. I mean, I always ask, like Deleuze-Guattari, okay, if there is a concept, there must be a problem. And the problematic of this extensive and extended use of the concept of the machine is that they ask from the inside of the historicity of technicity that is in the moment of being overcome, from the inside of this old formation, they try to grasp the coming formation of technicity. And the interesting point from our point of view is now that the transition went on and we start to look back. And that's the term, in a way, of our conceptual view. And therefore, I never speak about the machinic except when I mention Guattari, but I think he is the one who extended the concept more than any other of the guys mentioned, because he was the one who grasped the huge change in technicity that we are facing. So, but I would rather describe it as a symptom of a historical change. I mean, you have Guattari saying, okay, that's my machinic concept, that's not techniques anymore. You have Günther who said, okay, I talk about the machine, but actually I talk about the second machine, and so on. You have all these hesitations in using even the concept. But I agree, you are completely right that the concept as such might be not of any use for a diagnosis of our contemporary situation.
Another question over there.
I have a simple question. Have you perhaps thought of new terms to replace machine in the face of new technological fields? And in this process, like, have you come up with an alternative?
No. And it's, I mean, I'm sure, I can't think of anything now. I'm sure that if we look at the current discourses around, both the techno-ecologies and notions of the posthuman, I'm sure that we will find a language that tries to get away from this dichotomy and takes the risk of writing both the human and the machine out of a description. But it's not a question of replacing one term by the other, but it's really a different way of thinking. And I think it's quite scary to have to think subjectivation. That is, that what we think of us, or that what constitutes ourselves, as something that is operating in a paradigm that we don't understand yet, and that for which there is no language, and which might change in such radical ways that it undermines many ways in many things that we take for granted in our world. One of the most scary things for me personally is the fact that our understanding of democracy is based on the modernist subject, on the idea of one person, one vote, and the possibility of taking sovereign decisions as an individual. And if you take the posthumanists' drift, if you take that seriously, I don't know what happens to your concept of democracy that is going to work on a scale of states. And I think that we have to be, as intellectuals, we have to be really careful, because what we say in forums like this gets translated into really horrible pre-post-democratic politics that we really don't like. I think that fascism is maybe, one way of kind of dealing with those kinds of questions would be to show how the fascist movements of the first half of the 20th century had a determinately post-human understanding of human subjects, that as a way to make us really scared of being flippant with a discourse that dispels our humanity.
You said that the last chapter of your book deals with more contemporary artistic forms of engagement with technology in that sense, in a post-human sense?
No, it points in that direction. The book is really about the 20th century.
Okay.
It has the 20th century in the title, and it stops where maybe for our conversation now it would get interesting, but I'm an art historian, and I take the liberty of saying, here's the period that I look at, and now there's something else. There's a little outlook, and all of these things I hope will make people think about how is it different from our situation now. But I think that there's a watershed that you can, if you like, put in the year 2007, the introduction of the iPhone, that has so dramatically changed the way in which people interact with technical devices and the way in which they kind of log into the internet and everything that is connected to it. This is just an emblem. I'm not saying that it happened in 2007, but things that started already in the 90s, I think that after 2007, maybe the introduction of the iPhone is our 11th of September. A point that is the break that is so big that we can't easily go back and say, we just connect to a previous period.
We have another question over there.
Thanks for the talk. Fantastic. There's one way in which the notion of a machine has been used, which I'm inclined to hear very positively, and it's reflected in several of the context-specific usages you mentioned. And it starts with Descartes, interestingly. I mean, one of Descartes' fantastic moves was to say, look, the universe is a giant machine. It's a giant machine because we don't need to go outside the language of, say, physical science, mechanics as it was then, to understand it. And the human body is just like that. It's a very complex form of that. Of course, Descartes, being very smart, then noticed that we have to think about things like the well-functioning machine, and that's slightly different to the notion of just a giant mechanical unfolding. And he also noticed, I mean, when he talks about the machine in the discourse on the method, he talks about a machine as a selection of special purpose mechanisms, which of course the Turing notion of the machine overcomes. But that idea that somehow we're demystifying something about the world and something about ourselves is something that's replicated through a lot of those thinkers. You know, Turing spends a lot of time in that 1950 paper trying to say that we can understand various aspects of intelligence through the digital computer. We don't need anything beyond that. Even Maturana, I mean, the whole notion of the machine there, the orthopedic machine, is supposed to get away from having to use teleological language that somehow takes us outside of an ordinary mechanical science. And I take that to be a very positive thing. Even Harold Cohen, for instance in computer art, I mean, what did he try to do? He tried to write programs that will produce creative paintings in order to explain his own creativity. That's why he started doing it. And I wonder what you thought about that very positive sort of story about how the notion of the machine might be used to demystify, and whether what you're seeing in the future, which gets beyond the human and the machine, whether that's continues a process of demystifying or somehow introduces something back into the picture that previous story lost.
Thank you for the question. I have to think about that. I don't know. I don't have a quick answer. I'd rather do that over lunch, or sorry, it's maybe my brain's kind of going slow now. It's really interesting. Yeah, no, I can't think of anything meaningful at the moment.
Yeah.
So,
We have more.
the last question now, and then I think we have to have a short break to prepare for the next lecture, like 10-minute break after the answer of that question. And of course,
Sure.
During lunch, you can all continue talking.
And just maybe I can give a short response to that. I think like the machinic art that you describe in your book is that positive answer, because these are instances of like grappling, like creative ways of grappling with the concept of the machine that are beautiful and thought-provoking. Right? So this kind of art can be seen as something very productive that came out of the concept of the machine, or not?
No, I think that a lot of the works that I can think of now quickly are dealing with the mystifications, are kind of struggling against the mystifications, but in an aesthetic kind of exaggerating aesthetic manner, so that that sense of obscurity is heightened rather than divested.
Oh, yeah.
In the discourses that I've looked at, the worry about the machine is always much bigger than what you're saying, this kind of dimension of demystification, enlightenment, and so on. People are more fearful of machines than they are embracing them. And, you know, the machine love that I didn't really talk about today is something that is almost openly perverse. It's something that people do as a provocation. When Heiner Müller says or writes in the Hamlet-Maschine, ich will eine Maschine sein, then it's a rejection of anything that comes with a humanist understanding of the body. So, yeah, no.
Okay. One last question.
I don't know. It might have been answered, but like, thank you first of all. It's one comment. It's actually interesting that you bring up the iPhone, because I think there's something really key in there, in as much as it kind of like through its design, it like changed the paradigm of interfaciality into something that makes this like the symbolicness of this kind of machine really explicit. So with doing away with the buttons, basically it kind of like brought to front the true nature of that kind of, I mean, not device, but like the larger thing, that it can be anything really. And I think that that's kind of what the moment. But my question, I mean, as I said, you probably answered it, but I would be interested in what you would kind of consider the watershed moment to come to be. Like, would it be something like strong AI? Would it be synthetic biology, like real artificial life? Or would it be the kind of appreciation of the apparatus versus like over the machine, you know? Like, what's the kind of thing that would really change would cause the rupture in subjectivity as you kind of laid out in the future?
Oh, that's what I would go with Eric's answer to my question about cybernetics yesterday. It happened 100 years ago or more. So we are already in that condition, and that's why, for me, kind of when I have my hilarious moments, then I think it's so weird that we still speak about machines. I mean, and over the last years of working on the book, I've kind of somehow trained myself to be more restrictive in the usage. But it's funny that we still think of technology, that the way in which we are inscribed in technology, that we can somehow ban that by saying, a machine.
And it also gets inscribed in us in a way. So like if you look at that historically in terms of like anthropogeny, which is this field that looks at like what makes humans, they consider cooking, for example, to be like a technology that has had a massive impact on us, on our body basically. So like the shape of our teeth is kind of the result of a machine, and it's us basically. So it's kind of, yeah.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up here. Thank you again for this wonderful talk. Thank you very much for these really intelligent questions. And then we will convene here again in maybe 10 minutes for the second keynote.